Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Stallman, Associate Professor of Psychological Science and the Faculty Coordinator for UMW's Day on Democracy. It is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce this year's keynote address by Dr. Melissa Martinez. We are so grateful to have her speak to the campus community on this election day. Dr. Martinez is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Affairs at the University of Mary Washington. She has a PhD in political science from the University of North Texas with a focus on international relations and comparative politics. She teaches courses in Latin American politics and human rights. She is currently working on a book project examining human rights abuses in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. She has done fieldwork in Mexico City and Guatemala City and has published her work in numerous academic journals, including the International Science Quarterly and Social Science Quarter. Please welcome Dr. Melissa Martinez.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Thank you, Professor Stallman, for your introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on this day of democracy. So as Professor Stallman mentioned, I am Melissa Martinez, and I teach in the Department of Political Science and International Affairs. So while my focus of expertise is in international human rights, for this talk, I will focus on where the United States currently stands in respect to human rights and support for democratic values. And I will also share U.S. public opinion on these particular components. And then I will move forward and provide an analysis and suggestions on how citizens in the United States, including U.S. students, could support a future with support for human rights and democratic values here in the United States. So today marks a very important day because you get to practice the right to vote. And so in this presentation, I will let you know why this is important, especially for this particular election and for the United States. And so a place for us to start is with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this year we celebrate the 74th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was created in 1948. And so this declaration was created to set international standards for human rights. It declared that countries sought to respect the rights of their citizens. One of the creators of the declaration was Eleanor Roosevelt, who's pictured here holding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Eleanor Roosevelt was not only former President Franklin Roosevelt's wife, but she was also a U.S. diplomat and a big promoter of human rights. The declaration was written with a few other diplomats, lawyers, and scholars from other parts of the world, including France, United Kingdom, India, Chile, Australia, China, Lebanon, and the former Soviet Union, right? So there were different, although not everybody that is currently a country participated, there were different parts of the world that were representing a declaration to support human rights. Now, this was a vision that was created, again, early in the history, right, when the international platform was created, which is the United Nations. Now, this was a vision, right? They envisioned to create a world where we could protect and support the protection of human rights. Although this vision was created internationally, the United States still had a long way to go to fully support human rights at home, since it was still practicing racial segregation at home and lacked support for reproductive rights and continued to have discriminatory practices at home, right? So this, again, was an international vision, but there was still a long way to go domestically.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them? And how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation and be paid and treated fairly. The Declaration takes no sides as to which rights are more important, insisting on their universality, indivisibility, and interdependence. And in the past decades, international human rights law has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations, but they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations, to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights, and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
And so, even though the vision for human rights can start internationally, a lot of the hard work really begins domestically. And that is because it takes civil society organizations, their mobilization and ability to pressure governments to change policies that support their vision, right? Which might reflect international law and support for human rights. And so for this reason, civil society organizations play a huge role when it comes to the advancement of human rights. And we can set an example here from the United States, right? So the United States has many interest groups and organizations that are dedicated to promote human rights. So some of these include the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, also known as the ACLU, and women's rights organizations, along with many others, that are located in the United States, right, and have been able to pressure the government to support and advance human rights. And so in many cases, right, including here in the United States, these domestic organizations are, for the most part, grassroots organizations that are largely supported many times by marginalized groups, right, that use the organization and themselves as numbers to pressure the government to promote these human rights. And so one example comes from the NAACP. So the NAACP is the largest American civil rights movement. Now, with the help of civil rights leader at the time in 1954, Thurgood Marshall, who's pictured here, he was the head of the NAACP at the time and a civil rights attorney who won the case on Brown versus Board of Education, which led to the elimination of racial segregation in public schools. Now, in addition to their court litigation, right, the NAACP also helped organize one of the largest civil rights marches in Washington back in 1963, and the association also lobbied the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It was also able to lobby for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Now, you might be thinking, well, why is this relevant today? Well, it's relevant for many reasons. We are dealing with human rights concerns abroad, including the repression against Iranian protesters, the Myanmar military abuses, China's genocide events against the Uyghur population, among many others, including the human rights violations that are taking place currently with the Russia and Ukraine conflict. In addition to that, we are also dealing with human rights concerns domestically, including racial discrimination, harsh detention and deportation policies, and reversals on reproductive rights. And so although the rhetoric has been that these are partisan issues, the fact is that human rights issues should not be divided by ideology or political party, right? These are standards that have been set and even accepted in other liberal democracies, right, and international law. Now we can turn to one example. And this example pertains reproductive rights. So in June 2022, right, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which means that the constitutional right to an abortion is no longer protected. It is now up to each state to establish laws protecting or restricting abortion. Now, although this remains a partisan issue here in the United States, there is actually an international law that protects reproductive rights, which the United States has not ratified. And so this international law is called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So this convention supports women's rights to health, including sexual and reproductive health. And in fact, in July of this year, the United Nations Women's Rights Committee said that the United States is one of 7 countries that has not ratified the convention that supports women's rights, including the right to sexual and reproductive health. And the committee mentioned that unsafe abortions are the leading cause to maternal mortality and morbidity. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if it signs it or ratifies it, but it is not supported? Well, I'll get back to that and how domestic groups and civil society organizations can actually use international law especially if a state has ratified it, to promote these rights. Now, the contrast with backstepping on reproductive rights happening in the United States and the improvements of those rights taking place elsewhere is stark. For example, just last year, Mexico's Supreme Court decriminalized abortion, and before the two rulings in Mexico and the United States, women in Mexico would travel to the US to get an abortion. Now the flow has flipped, where women close to the border and who are also able to travel seek services from Mexican women's clinics and advocates. So the contrast is stark because Mexican activists for reproductive rights have often looked at the United States to reflect on the possibilities for women's rights in Mexico. In Mexico's movement, reproductive health organizations played a big role in shifting support for women's reproductive rights. They began to educate Mexican citizens about the fact that criminalizing abortions was not ending the practice, and there was a movement that grew in support of reproductive rights called the Green Tide, which is pictured here, which was mostly composed of women in their 20s and 30s using emerald-colored handkerchiefs who supported the right to legal abortions. So their inspiration for the movement came from women in Argentina, which legalized abortions in addition to the reversals on reproductive rights. The United States has also faced censorship via book banning. So those who support the book bans fear that children will be swayed by the contents of the book, while opponents of the bans argue that this censorship impedes freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and undermines tolerance towards others. And this is particularly important in a country that has a largely diverse population, right? So it is important for a country like the United States to promote tolerance of others. Now, in addition to reversals on human rights, there has also been democratic backsliding in the United States. So democratic backsliding is when domestic leaders weaken their country's institutions that protect civil liberties and political freedoms. Now, it's difficult to talk about human rights without talking about democratic institutions, right? So in order to promote human rights, we also need to sustain and promote democracy, which allow us to gather and use the tools of democracy to promote these rights. So it is worth visiting why there has been reversal, right, or democratic backsliding, and what can be done. Now, one of the components here to examine is that there have been multiple indexes that examine the status of democracy across different parts of the world. And they vary, right, in terms of the types of measures that they use to measure democracy. However, for the most part, most of them are based on factors like free and fair elections, comprehensive voting rights, freedom of association and expression, among other factors, right? And what has been found is that across these multiple indexes, the United States has been classified as a flawed democracy or a democracy that has been backsliding. Now, these indexes include the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, the Electoral Democracy Index, and Polity 5, which are used by political scientists and others to examine the level of democracy across different parts of the world. Now, in this map here, right, it shows the United States as a flawed democracy. Again, there's multiple indexes here, right, that show that the United States is a flawed democracy and has experienced democratic backsliding. So on the bright side, and there is a bright side, a national poll conducted in 2020 found that a majority of people polled agreed that the United States faces serious threats. And so this poll, which was conducted by the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, examined attitudes on civil rights issues, which included voting rights, police reform, racial discrimination, equal opportunity, healthcare, and housing. Although some issues are partisan, others are not. And so one example of bipartisanship on these civil rights issues is shown here on the pie chart on the left. So here it shows that a large majority of Americans with various partisan support, so Democrat, Republican, Independent, support improvements in the electoral process to protect the right to vote, encourage voting, and reduce voting restrictions. For example, this pie chart lists the percentage of respondents who agreed that the United States Justice Department should review new state or local state voting regulations to ensure they do not discriminate against voters based on race. Not included in the charts is that a majority also agree, and this is across the three partisan platforms, that independent state commissions should determine the map of legislative districts to prevent partisan gerrymandering. So again, there is consensus there on those types of civil liberties. Now, on the second chart, which is two bar graphs here, right, it shows the percentages of people or respondents who support police practices where, police practices where the chart or the bar graph on the left shows the percentage of Americans who believe that Americans should have the right to sue police officers for violations of civil rights. And so again, right, this is across the three partisan platforms. And then on the right, it shows the percentage based on partisan support who believe that police should be held accountable for violent or unlawful behavior. And here you see that a majority, right, across the three partisan platforms, there's a bipartisan support for holding police accountable for unlawful behavior. Nevertheless, right, there are also other issues where there is a larger gap on attitudes in some civil rights issues that are based on partisan support. So this bar graph here on the left is one example. So the bar chart shows that while there is bipartisan support for legal protection against racial discrimination in housing and employment, and legal protection against disability discrimination in the workplace, there is a larger partisan gap on discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, I'll come back to this bar graph here in a little bit. What I want to show, since we are already showing a gap, right, when it comes to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, there is something to consider. So one is that according to a Pew Research poll, which was conducted cross-nationally, right, it has shown that attitudes on accepting homosexuality, right, have slowly been shifting in the United States, meaning that there are more people today that accept homosexuality in comparison to the past, right? Now, although there is larger acceptance of homosexuality in society, right, there's still a global divide that is shown in this map, right, where you can see that the United States still does not fall where we would like it to fall, right? And so here the map shows from 0 to 100 percentages based on this Pew Research survey who say homosexuality should be accepted by society. And here you see that although the United States has a darker green, which means it has a higher percentage, right? It is not at the darker green, which is where we want it to be and where other countries have been able to achieve, right? Now, that is also to say that this is only one component of LGBTQ rights, right? There's also the conversation on trans rights and support for other issues within the LGBTQ community that are not presented here. Now, going back to this bar graph here, this is where it shows where the largest gap that we see here in terms of support for economic rights. And so here it provides a the percentages of respondents based on partisan support, right, who believe or agree that the pandemic has demonstrated the need for more government support in the following areas. So we see a gap here in terms of a need for universal health care, another partisan gap here with public education, a third gap here with affordable housing, and a fourth gap here with fair employment, right? So again, there are some issues in terms of civil liberties where there is consensus. There's other issues also in terms of civil liberties where there's lack of consensus. And then there seems to be a large gap when it comes to economic rights. Now, what's also interesting is that when it comes to supporting human rights in foreign policy, there seems to be support for human rights abroad. For example, the following charts here, based on a different Pew Research poll, indicates that there is a bipartisan majority who supports the promotion of human rights in China, even if it harms relations with China, right? So here, again, you see the percentage of people or respondents that support a more assertive stance on bilateral relations with China across a range of issues, right? And so this is the issue in terms of human rights. And so 70% of respondents mentioned that the U.S. should try to promote human rights in China, even if it harms relations with China. And so if you look at the partisan support, right, you see that even then there's still a majority that supports a promotion for human rights in China, right? So that means, right, that there is some consensus in the United States, at least with some rights, and also with foreign policy. So altogether, what does this mean, right? What does it indicate? So although it is tough to determine with 100% certainty how Americans really feel about human rights, given the few samples from the study, it looks like there is some consensus on some issues, right? Now, just because we have been backsliding does not mean that we cannot recover. Moreover, one of the biggest culprits, right, that has been mentioned for why there is a substantial lack in support for human rights, or at least a backsliding, right, in the United States, has been the polarization that has taken place. And so a lot of political scholars, primarily American scholars that study American politics, right, have noted the huge polarization that has emerged over time. However, right, as somebody who studies different countries and human rights across different countries, it is worth noting that we can perhaps look at how other countries that have faced similar issues of polarization, because polarization is not unique to the United States, right? And so it is important to see how these other countries have been able to promote human rights when they have faced these levels of polarization in their countries. So, for example, we have the cases of Colombia and Mexico, where there was high level of polarization, especially on the issue of abortion, yet both countries managed to adopt reproductive rights in the past couple of years. And so here on the slide, on the left, I have Justice Alfredo Gutierrez Ortiz Mena of the Supreme Court of Mexico. And then on the right, I have Justice Natalia Angel Cabo of the Colombian Constitutional Court, who both recently reflected on the factors that led to the legalization of abortion in their respective countries. So both countries, what they noted, right, is that both countries experienced what was known as the Green Wave, which I mentioned earlier, right? And so this Green Wave is a movement for abortion laws that began in Argentina in the early 2000s. And so, for example, this picture here illustrates that movement in Argentina. This one here illustrates how the Colombians also adopted that Green Wave movement, and the Green Wave was also again adopted in Mexico, right? Mexico also used other symbols other than the green handkerchief in order to send a message, right, that women are still performing abortions, but now they are unsafe because they are illegal. So the movement campaign supported a right to legal, safe, and free abortions. More recently, Colombia legalized abortion of up to 24 weeks after conception, and the shifts towards support for abortion in Mexico were due to societal changes in views about civil liberties and human rights. And both countries had different approaches. For example, in the Mexican case, right, this shift in government support did not start in the Supreme Court. It actually started back in 2011 with the amendment of Article 1 to the Mexican Constitution, which stated that all individuals are entitled to the human rights granted by the Constitution and international treaties signed by Mexico. And so women's groups use this framework to gain support for abortion laws. Now, remember how I mentioned that earlier, right, that the United States has not ratified the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Towards Women, right? And so, again, right, some countries like Mexico have used the rhetoric, right, and legitimacy coming from a ratified treaty to build support domestically. And so this is a strategy that was used in Mexico. And so this built the momentum for 2021, where the Supreme Court banned the criminalization of abortion in the state of Coahuila, which set a precedent. Now, the opinion declared that denying access to abortion is discriminatory and unconstitutional. It declared that reproductive self-determination and access to free and safe abortion are constitutional rights, right? Now, Colombia had a different trajectory. In Colombia, there was a decriminalization, right? But it had a different development. In Colombia, its constitution declared that Colombia was a secular state, which led advocates to promote access to abortion based on public health and constitutional rights. And so what this meant is, because that idea that the Constitution is based on Colombia being a secular state, this drove religious and moral arguments of abortion to fall back. So Colombia women's organizations shifted the focus of the abortion debate to public health issues. And so these organizations then launched litigation in the courts and created persuasive media campaigns to increase support for the legalization of abortion, right? So this means that there was now a new framework, right? A new introduction of abortion and support for the legalization of abortion because of public health concerns. Additionally, the women's groups highlighted that criminalization of abortion did not actually prevent these procedures, which is in a way what many of these countries attempt to do, right? They criminalize abortion or they ban abortion as a way to stop it. But in fact, right, and what was noted not only in Colombia, but this was also noted in Mexico, is that it did not stop abortions. They continue to happen, but now, right, these procedures were affecting poor, marginalized women that sought unsafe abortions, which created a public health crisis. Nevertheless, although there had been a shift in attitudes towards reproductive rights, this does not mean that, again, right, this is all cemented in either Mexico or Colombia. There is still polarization that continues to exist in the country. For example, after Colombia's court ruling, Colombia faced 67 petitions asking to annul the ruling. So polarization on the issue continues, right? Now, different from the Mexican and Colombian ruling, right? If we think about how it compares to the United States, we can see that there is a way to build support over these rights, even in the midst of polarization, right? Rather, in the case of the United States, it's more about the Supreme Court that has become isolated on the issue of abortion from public opinion in the United States, as many polls have indicated that for the most part, a majority of Americans support the legalization of abortion, right? In terms of when they supported, it varies, right? Some supported on certain cases, others supported in any case. So because of this contrast, right, of public opinion in the United States and the U.S. Supreme Court, this means that it really is up to the citizens to mobilize and use the tools of democracy to change the current reversal on reproductive rights and to support other human rights across the board, right? It really is up to the mobilization of citizens. Now, this is not just for issues that have been reversed, right, or have backslided, but also on other issues regarding human rights that we have yet to meet, right? And so a way to meet these rights, or a way to promote and support these rights, again, has to do with citizen mobilization and support for civil society organizations that promote these types of rights. Now, in addition to learning from what other countries have done to promote rights, right, we can also learn from our own past. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, right, we have made strides towards human rights and democracy in the past here in the United States and other parts of the world. So the question is, well, how can we learn, one, from our own previous experience, right, and from other countries? And so there are different ways to promote these rights and to promote democratic values, which again are important for citizens to promote rights in the first place, any type of right. There needs to be a democratic platform, right, in order to be able to do that. So promoting both human rights and democratic values is just as important. So there are a few ways to support the promotion of these rights and democratic values, right? So one is voting. So again, this is why today is very important, right? You practice the right to vote, which is not allocated for everybody in the world, right? And so this is your ability to really, pick candidates that fall the closest to your own policies or to your own vision of what you want to see in the United States. And so, again, one way to be politically active is via elections. So voting is very, very important. Second, right, if you're not eligible or if you want to do more, right, there's a lot more that can be done. So you may also be politically active by writing a letter to your representative, right? Or you don't have to physically write a letter. You can also email your representative. You can call your representative and let them know about the issues that you have in mind, or concerns or policies, right? So one way that you can inform yourself is by visiting the web pages, seeing what they are supporting, what they are against, right? And where you stand. It is both to important to let them know what you support and also what you dislike and do not support. So the third type of political participation, which is very important, especially when it comes to promoting support for civil society, and I have mentioned throughout this lecture, right, many examples of how civil society plays a big role in promoting human rights. And so this is why this third type of political participation is very important. And so this includes volunteering, donating, or educating yourself and others about organizations that support policies that you care about, right? And if you're not sure about which organizations support policies that you care about, you can always look up online and see what different organizations are doing, right? And the types of policies that they are promoting. And you don't, especially as a student, right? You don't have to donate, during this time, but you can participate by volunteering or again, just educating yourself and others, right? Which brings me to a point, right? Or as I would call it, a sub-point of that third political participation component, which is that you can also start conversations, right? And spark conversations about these issues. Talk to people about these issues. One, because it opens up, it creates a sense of vulnerability to be able to talk about politics because of this level of polarization. So opening up and talking about these issues, talking about, what concerns others have, talking about the gap in knowledge, right? And being able to open yourself and understand what gap is there, because sometimes not everybody is fully informed, right? And so having these conversations is really important. And I would say the fourth one is, you can have other types of political participation, right? So the United States, for example, allows support for petitions, right? That support policies that you stand for and that you support. Or those that support human rights and democratic values, battling against unequal or against disenfranchisement here in the United States, right? Other components include freedom of assembly, which is supported here in the United States, and that means that you can peacefully protest, right, as another way of participation. But again, it also means that using that avenue, right, to spark conversations, to begin thinking and educating yourself and others about these particular issues. So while the promotion of human rights and democratic values, is very important during a time of elections, right? You can continue this promotion even after elections. So lastly, I would like to connect why the promotion of human rights here in the United States and, of course, the promotion of democratic values is not only important for, of course, domestic policy and for our everyday life, right, here in the United States, but it's also important for foreign policy. And one of the reasons why it's important is because it becomes more difficult to build legitimacy, right, to pressure other governments to support human rights, especially during this time where there have been many issues of repression against marginalized groups, right? And so it becomes more difficult to pressure other countries to support human rights and to mitigate repression when we ourselves are falling behind in terms of human rights and democracy, right? So this is not to say that we have no hope, but rather quite the opposite, right? We still operate via free and fair elections, and the use of this election, right, is to promote democratic values so that you can support improving the health of this democracy, right? It's falling a little bit ill, but you can promote its health, right? And also promote rights along the way. So again, So hopefully this, inspires you to really think and consider about what conversations you're having with others on issues that you deeply care about, how you are involved, right, in your own community to promote rights and democratic values. So I hope you all enjoyed the lecture and enjoy the rest of the Day of Democracy.